Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all again. My name is Renee Antrosio. I have the privilege of being the pastor at New Covenant Fellowship and facilitating these conversations. I do want to start out by saying our last session, I asked Reverend Terrence Thomas of Bethel AME to specifically address the Black Manifesto of 1969 and their call to the Christian church based on our history for reparations. And what I omitted in that, we focused on the Christian church and the history of both the Protestant and the Catholic Church in white supremacy and slavery. But what I did not address, and I would like to apologize for, is that the Black Manifesto wrapped synagogues into that conversation. And I should have said, synagogues, as we know, have a very different history in this country and have also been, of course, the targets of white supremacy. And I should have made it clear that we were only going to focus on our part as the Christian church in that history. And so I want to apologize for that, because especially as we've been on a journey at New Covenant to remind ourselves that anti-Semitism has been woven into the church for centuries, and it is something that it's very easy for us to fall into and to not recognize. And so we don't want to perpetuate that either in our understanding of the Black Manifesto or in any of these conversations. So I own that. I am sorry for that. Our focus is on our responsibility as white Christians in America and our history. So without further ado, I'm gonna turn this over to Jeff Trask. He has been teaching at New Covenant for many years and continues to teach regularly for us, which I greatly appreciate. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Jeff.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Renee. I appreciate the intro. So I'd like to, first of all, just kind of start with a word of prayer. So if you pray with me. Father, we ask, Lord, that you be in the midst of our conversation. We openly admit right off the bat, Lord, that we don't have the answers. And so, Lord, we're just kind of seeking your counsel and how to move forward with all the information and thoughts and ideas that have been presented to this point. Lord, we know that as long as we act in faith, that you'll honor our efforts. And we ask, Lord, that you just kind of give us the insight and boldness to move forward. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so obviously the first three lectures or discussions were pretty lecture heavy. So I really want to focus in on people having an opportunity to share their thoughts. I have a PowerPoint, but it's really more of a guide for discussion more than anything else. And so we'll spend our time just kind of chit-chatting about some of the things that have been discussed in the last three presentations, and we'll just kind of go from there. Again, I do have some ideas I'd like to share at some point, but I want to start off just by opening up the floor for anyone who have any types of reactions, responses, or questions to any of the previous discussions that we've had. There's been some very information-rich sessions, but again, I know, and so it's a lot to process. I'm just curious, is there any conversation or things that people want to say in any of these sessions, and felt like just didn't have time to, because it was very content heavy. So this is the opportunity to kind of start the little discussion there. So just any in general questions, reactions, comments.
I'm a fairly historical guy. I read a lot of history, fascinated by it, impressed by it, encouraged by it. Anyway, so, I felt, since I've spent dealing with different aspects, political aspects, such as the civil rights movement, I probably have a pretty good knowledge of what, what went on. And I don't have to take much to convince me that how bad it was. Same thing with being partly Jewish, reading about the Holocaust. But I truly, particularly with Dr. Finkelstein, is that what his name was? Yeah, Finkelstein, yeah. I was amazed to learn deeper depths of the horror of what happened that I didn't know about, that actually haunted me. I remember one particular thing that he just kind of mentioned almost in a couple phrases was how in Mississippi after the war. They basically it reminded me of when the Western settlers had open range on the passenger pigeons and the buffaloes, that they literally in Mississippi said it's open range on Black people, particularly Black men, and we don't even know how many of them they just shot down because they could, like they could a buffalo or something, and it just was so horrific. I didn't know that. I mean, I knew a lot of stuff, but I didn't know that, and there are other things in that level, but just astonished to find, not only in that area, but in some of the other areas they mentioned, a level of villainy and cruelty that took place, so it's almost like I'm 100% for reparations, but it's almost like it's not repairable on that level because it's just so horrific. I mean, how can you repair the Holocaust? You can't repair the Holocaust. But of course, you can do things that make a difference in people's lives now, and we want to do that. But nonetheless, that's what I learned. So, thanks.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned that, it kind of made me think about too how that context was preserved throughout the years, because you think about, for example, the assassination of Medgar Evers, or the bombing of the killing the 4 girls in the church, where the people who did those things weren't convicted till years and years and years later. They're like, old on, oxygen, it's like, and before they ever got convicted of those things. So it was like, it was started way back when, but you can see how contextually it just kind of kept going as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks for sharing.
So the last conversation that we had, my sister-in-law was here. My sister-in-law is Japanese American. Both of her parents were in internment camps during World War II, and the US government paid them reparations. So, not to say that wasn't horrible what happened, but that was like a smidge of what the US government has done in terms of, African Americans. It's like it's time to own up, this is ridiculous. So that's, I had forgotten that her parents had been paid reparations by the US government.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, why isn't our government paying people?
Absolutely. And I think for some people, the response is maybe 4 years of horrible treatment in the United States internment camps is something that you can put your mind around, but centuries of slavery, and free labor is something much more difficult to put your head around. Not that it gives any excuse for it, but it actually is the opposite, right? That means that much more should be paid attention to. How do you try to, invoke some reparations? But I think that's kind of part of it. But I appreciate you bringing out the history that this is not an unprecedented thing either, right? This has been done before in terms of reparations.
One of the problems we get into reparations is it's impossible to ignore what happened to Native Americans. And as much as, obviously not trying to distract at all from reparations for slavery, nonetheless, the history is so horrific that if one thing happens, it's inevitable that the other thing's going to be brought up, and it should be.
Mm-hmm. As an African-American person, I always would say, as horrible as African-Americans have had it, at least we're still here, right? Yeah. Where you can't really say that the case for the Native American population, where there's very, very small amount left from what was here before. So yeah, absolutely.
I think it's hard to find a good place between feeling like, oh my gosh, this is so complicated and so big and so hopeless, so we can't do anything, versus I need to do something today. And so we need to do something that's informed and that's helpful. And I'm encouraged by this whole series because I think that this can help us over time get to the place of finding something that's meaningful and good. I also think our community is kind of primed for it. The United Way just had their series that ended on Juneteenth of the Equity Challenge, and there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people who did that. It's obviously in the public consciousness. So I think we can do something.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And we definitely will be talking a little bit later about some practical things that we can do that are within reach, we can get to that. Mhm.
What I'd like to just get what's in people's minds about the we. Who's the we?
Good point.
I want to make, at least for me, I want to make some distinctions between individual people and various institutions, of which there are many that we might be speaking about. So to me, it would be helpful to have a more coherent conversation to specify the we.
No, that's a good idea.
Julian, I think you know the answer, and I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Who?
Julian,
Julian has the answer?
well, I mean, I was being a little facetious, but this man has thought about this a lot, and I think I know where he's coming from, and I would like to hear what he has to say.
Well, I wasn't prepared to give a.
You know.
How about this, Julian? I'll answer and then you can correct me and then we'll get somewhere. So I think that one of the things that these conversations has convinced me is that we need to put pressure on our government officials to respond as a nation, since this was a national government thing, since it was by law that we need to do that at that level. And I was just talking with Pastor Janet before we got on that the Friday night prayer service that was so widespread across our faith community also gave me hope that perhaps as a wider faith community, we could, I don't know if I want to say put pressure, but perhaps really say to our city officials and our county officials, this is what we want for our town, for our, for our government. And at a national level, I don't know if what we can do, because that's not my specialty. So I think part of the we is at the secular level, what can the faith institutions do to influence our local politics? As the pastor of New Covenant, I think there are some things that we as a church can do. And then as an individual, I think that there are things that we can also do individually if we are moved to do so, whether it's connecting with funds through the church or different organizations. So that would be my answer, individually and at a church level and at a faith level, working to make the government do what they should do. What do you think, Julian?
Well, I certainly agree that a fair amount of this is the governments that presumably represent us. And most of the things that we've heard, I think, in these sessions, I can't remember everything, and I think I missed one of them actually, but I think most of the things that we heard about were things that have to do with our national social policies and a national history. Some of it gets specified in particular states. I haven't heard very much about Champaign County and Champaign and Urbana as cities, but I can say that it might be, I don't know if everybody knows this or not, but there were written into the real estate laws here, right here in Champaign Urbana, restrictive covenants that were in effect as late as sometime into the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And those restrictive covenants, they had to do with not selling real estate to African Americans. Jews were included, by the way, in some of that as people you shouldn't be selling your homes to. And we all know about redlining in general, but I wonder what we know about local instances of it. And we know a lot about segregation in these communities and disparate schooling and neglect of school buildings north of University Avenue, and building the Beckman Center with its back turned to north with no entrance from the north-hand side. So, we have the university, we've got the cities, we've got the state, we have the county for sure. So, I mean, I think sometimes it gets, for me at least, I don't think it's hard for me to support political candidates in Congress who would be understanding these things and be in favor of a national policy. But I think that we need to I think we could be more maybe impactful if we pay some attention to local policies. And also, I think it would be good if we could, I'm curious as to what kind of reaction we would get if we tried to engage with other churches. I mean, I wonder how many local churches would now feel responsible for what the organized Christian church did or didn't do, what policies were supported over the last N number of years. So it would be interesting to me to just see if we could even get a united, widespread across, including the mainline denominations,
Sure.
let alone the independent churches. So anyway, that's kind of the beginning of my thinking about it. Is just, it's useful in terms of organizing and thinking about what we want to do, to know who the we are. And so if we're talking about ourselves as a church in this community, which I suppose we are talking about ourselves, it seems to me that one appropriate thing to do is engage with other churches and try to get come together to put pressure on local officials who I think are responsible for a great deal of local discrimination and local hurtfulness toward people of color. So anyway, that's what I think offhand, without actually having written out anything for myself, which is usually the only way I can figure out what I think.
Janet, I would just like to just underscore what Julian has shared with a special focus on not only our paying attention to the local landscape and being aware of the many dynamics in central Illinois, having grown up here in a sundown town and now returning to be involved in the kind of work that we are convicted to take up, that we do need to lift up our history, the conditions, and that at the same time there is great power in bringing the faith community together, and many communities here. I mean, we, First Mennonite Church and New Covenant are not the only faith communities in town that have been doing serious work around white supremacy. So, in a broad brush, and they may have different names for it, but the Racial Taboo film opened up a lot of conversations, and there is, I think, some real opportunity. So I just want to underscore and say amen to that general approach. I think it's promising.
Absolutely.
Well, you haven't had a chance. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think the question, in addition to who is the we, I think what is reparations? And I think, there are certainly things that we can do as a church and individual on a local level. But, I guess things that I read about reparations say that if you're going to have meaningful reparations, they have to significantly impact the economic well-being of those people that were affected by it. And that means the federal government is the only institution that has access to the resources that we're going to need, because we're talking about trillions of dollars, which, seems like a lot of money, but, we've just found a few $1 trillion this year to do stuff that we didn't do before, and we haven't even raised taxes yet. And so if you budgeted that, $1 trillion or $2 every year, in a decade or two, we could make a difference. And I think that that's really important. And if we talk about maybe some local things, there are certainly things that we can do, but is that really reparations, or is that something else?
Well, what do you think about what Evanston is trying to do? That's a local.
Right.
thing.
And it would seem to me that that's that's a pretty small drop in the bucket. It's certainly something that's good, but is that really reparations? I guess that's my question.
Oh,
One of the things that my daughter-in-law, Margaret, keeps saying to me about all these things is she keeps saying, and she's from social work, and some scholar said that she doesn't claim it's hers, but she's the one that keeps saying to me, is that we need to think about everything at the micro level and at the meso level and at the macro level, that they're all three always at work. They interplay, but they really are different. And, at the micro level, I think there is reparation involved if we pressure our friends who are bosses to hire people of color. That is one kind of micro reparation. Or if I get my siding put on by a company that's run by a person of color rather than do what just naturally I would tend to do, which is pick up the phone, and 9 out of 10 times they're going to be white. And so I think there are a lot of micro things where I give my money and so on. And then the middle ones we're talking about, the local church, several churches, the community, and then the macro, the one we're all wishing that our government would do, state and federal. But it seems to me like they're all three important, that they all matter, and there is a form of repairing in each of them. And I know that one person getting a better job doesn't fix the government, but it sure might fix that family, and that matters. It matters a lot. And traditionally, that family doesn't get it. It goes to a white family.
There's another way to think about, which I'm glad that we're having the conversation. I apologize if I'm going to talk too much, but it's completely different than what I've been saying so far. I was initially just trying to clarify for myself and others what we're talking about. And we've gotten some going on that, but there's an element in this that I think is totally important, and I'm afraid that we'll go down a path, that it's easy to go down a path of wanting to do good things without actually engaging real human beings for whom we think we're going to be doing these good things. So I don't think we should move forward with anything without consultation with, for me, it would be local African-American human beings, to hear what they want to do.
absolutely.
In this community. And if it's go lobby in Congress, fine. If it's help local institutions, fine. I mean, whatever it is, I don't know what it is. So because I have not inquired in any systematic way, I know individual people, but so I guess what I'm saying is, if we're really going to take seriously what this is about, it seems to me we have to actually be led by the people of concern rather than just satisfying our own preconceived notions of what would be good for them.
That's what my other daughter always says to me. Right? Karen always says, why don't we listen to Black people first? Right.
I think.
And to your point, Julian, Lawndale, in the Chicago area, once upon a time, 40 years ago or so, was one of the worst inner city areas in the country, and like ranked 15th worst in the whole country. Lots of poverty, low income, poor education, lots of crime, go down a list. And so when Coach Wayne Gordon decided to plant himself there and basically try to help change that community, one of the things that the organization that kind of led him to do that, Christian Community Development Association, one of the tenets always were, ask the community what they want. And in this really run down, really messed up community, they put out the question to those who live there and say, we got lots of crime, we got poor education, we got need childcare, we need housing, we need employment. What do you all think should be our first ministry to everyone in this community based on all these needs that we have here? And I gave you 100 guesses. You probably wouldn't figure out what their first request was. And the first request was a laundromat. Why? Because women did not have a safe place to go to do their laundry. So the very first ministry of all the things they did since then, health center and all kind of major organizations they sprouted there, a laundromat was the first thing they did because they listened to the people who were in the community and what they needed. To your point.
And Jeff, piggybacking on that, something with the Cubs and some organizer up off of them is in a neighborhood in Chicago, and they did the same thing. And what they wanted was a grocery store. And so they're setting up a grocery store that's not going to screw them on the prices and make, for example, fresh vegetables available like close so they don't have, and so they're doing that, which is, and I just want to jump in and agree with Ron. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon, and many of us who are older may not be alive by the time this government moves around to do this the way we would like to see it. But for example, with the Lawndale, as great as this leadership was, and you're absolutely right, it has to come from that. How much greater would it have been if we had a federal government who was actually willing to put money into it so they could really have done something rather than piecemeal? So that was one thing, but just a couple of specific things I wanted to mention on this level. One is, I talked to Renee about this, and again, this couldn't be, I think, New Covenant Church leading it, or even a group of white leadership, but going to the city council, getting resolutions supporting reparations from both cities. It would be token on one level, but on another level, it would speak, be newsworthy for the federal government, knowing that local communities were saying it. And would it be controversial? Would it cause a lot of incredible discussion that has to happen, particularly among people who would absolutely be against it? That would be one thing. And the second thing, just going too long, I just sent Renee an article today because Julian whoever was mentioning about the university and the local, maybe it was Julian, about the local area and what kind of history in the community, whatever. In this Virginia college, came out today that they had done research, and they found out that 60 or 70 years ago, all the workers that they had either were slaves or were paid nothing or paid pittance. So they raised several $1 million or whatever. And they've located the living relatives of those people and have started paying them reparations. And there's a lot of mixed bag about that, whatever, but most of them have said, these are great-grandchildren saying, wow, that really makes a difference. That's incredible. I can now get an whatever. And to me, that seemed like an incredible practical way. I guarantee you, if we lifted the lid off the Champaign-Urbana area in terms of racial and Native American stuff, it would be a snake pit that would come out. And that could be a basis for talking specifically about individuals, So I'm just rattling on now, but I'm just saying back to what Ron said, the mini and the middle, the lower, the middle, and the macro, all of those can operate. And therefore, almost anybody, for example, real quick, you could get university students to research. They'd probably jump on that like crazy, research all that stuff to get all those information out about the people and what happened, stuff like that. Anyway, I'm rattling. That's enough.
I have one comment about the research. I probably many of you heard the talk that the head of the Habitat for Humanity, the local chapter, gave, or some of you may have, but he spent a COVID project for him was doing research about housing in this community. And because I had thought that I had that thought, we have a couple historians, unemployed historians in our congregation. I thought maybe we could pay them to do some research, but this man has put together he has a lot of information about all the injustices, some of which you mentioned, Julian.
Yeah,
so
I saw that report actually.
Yeah.
The people I'm on the county mental health board, and we got to look at that report as a part of that. It's nobody's doing anything about it, but they got the report.
We got the stuff. Yeah.
It's quite good, actually. I think very detailed.
Yeah.
And there is an oral history project that is being picked up again particularly under the rubric of the Museum of the Grand Prairie. They did a variety of oral histories with African-American citizens in the county, and they have a real commitment to now picking that up and expanding it. So I think that has the opportunity to not only build an archive, but to bring forward some testimonies that fit very well with what we're talking about.
My one thought about this, and I'd really like to hear Vern expound a little bit on this, because I'll do the same thing to Vern he did to me. Vern has a lot of experience in actual organizing to get things done. And one of the things that seems to me is that finding evidence that the society has been unbelievably hurtful to people of color is not hard. It's all out there.
Right.
You can put it together, you know, almost in no time, because it's so much is now so evident. So what I'm a little worried about is that it can become a waste of time to simply try to collect more information and make a report and have the report. And I think there's probably more sensible to move as rapidly as possible toward actually doing something with people that people want to get done. But that's just my feeling. And it comes from my own experience working as a university professor. My job was to come up with things like that. And often, once you say it, you think you've done it. And there's a big difference between saying it and doing it. So just because we could get it all said in an orderly fashion doesn't mean we would actually be accomplishing anything. I'll leave it.
We'll respond briefly if I can. One is that, not to scare people or anything, but when we were against companies producing chemical weapons, everybody said, yeah, and shook their head. But when we sat down in Noyes Hall and blocked the interviews from happening, they paid way more attention. And they actually got rid of those interviews. Anyway, but back to what you're saying, I think that what you said, and I think Jeff echoed this too, because I learned this the hard way too in the movement back then, is this, we cannot move forward without African-American leadership. It's just, you know, unless we find out who in the Black community is doing that, you know, if they have any organizations or people, you know, whatever, and basically coming alongside if they want us to, you know, and saying, you know, we'd like to do some things too, or what, you know, whatever, like in the Lawndale where they said, you know, what do you want? I think the same thing, that there's, and I think Renee and others more than me know some of those people, Jeff, Shirley, and Julian, and, you know, sit down and say, you know, we've been studying this. We think it's real. We want to do something, you know, but we don't want to go out and do something ahead of you or something that would be contrary or ineffective, whatever. And so I think that from an organizing point of view, that's an absolute first step, because if you get a group that is committed and feels good about each other and have, you know, that affirmation authority among them straightened out in the right way, then you're going to have like a wedge to move forward in a variety of ways. And it could be everything from, yes, the research could be just words, but without the research, you may not find out what to do, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's multi-level things, and it's not going to look the same in every community. So that would be my recommendation, is to try to find, you know, locate and maybe help bring together people that want to do this and then be part of it. Well, and I don't know if the church thing would be independent of that, or would be the church with the community. You know, those are questions to ask, but some coalition that has some legs and brains to move forward together, led by the African-American community, I think is absolutely essential. And so,
if one thing I'll add to that with the slide I put up is, you know, especially listening to the last reparation talk, but one of the greatest ways that you know, white brothers and sisters can advocate is to get other white brothers and sisters on board. I thought about, and I think I shared this a little bit with Renee in the email, but if New Covenant as a church and other churches that are already on board who've been participating in things like this can put this in a package and then reach out to other white denominations in town and have them go through the same process. You know, you're not going to get everybody, but if you keep collecting congregations and they have this in-depth look at these things, because I mean, for those who are not as you know, literate with history and other these kind of things, the other churches that they have folks who have that background, I think they'll be pretty shocked and surprised with a lot of the information that was shared just in these last 3 workshops and discussions. And I almost think about it as, you know, a coalition of churches that have been through this to form some type of institute where you can take this training, this knowledge, this process that you guys have been going through for the last few weeks, and have other churches, even if it's one at a time, have other churches as a church go through this same process. And you keep building up that coalition of white denominations, because at the end of the day, what has been most powerful with the most recent movement is the fact that for the first time, in my opinion, is not primarily just Black people who are concerned about this, to a point where, you know, I was sharing this morning how you see movements and you saw marches in some towns and communities that had almost more all white people there. In the past, you know, you have civil rights riots, or you have Rodney King and these kind of situations where primarily just Black people were mad and out in the street. Because of COVID or something else that was different this time around, it wasn't like that. It was a much more united, I mean, all around the world even. And so that to me is where that power lies. You know, if this country can spend, as someone made the comment earlier about the trillions of dollars needed on a national level, if this country could spend about $11-12 trillion on a war that was founded on a lie, then I think it could probably find $11-12 trillion for some type of form of reparations too. You know, it seems that the country finds money for things it want to find money for. It couldn't find money in the 80s with the crack epidemic in Black communities, but it's found a lot of money in most recent times with the opioid epidemic now and the crisis now. And so, well, what's the difference between those two? You know, what groups are being affected? It seemed like we have this first time ever, in my opinion, this truly joint effort of people coming together to try to make change and make things different. And I think that one of the ways we strengthen that is using that momentum while people may be softened up to these conversations, bring it to them and get deeper into it. And so they can join in and be part of that as well. And let's be honest, some of our mainline Christian denominations that include primarily, you know, white people have been the antagonists on a lot of these kind of things, right? So if we can shift that boat, because at the end of the day, we can talk about the church and the government, but at the same time, it's all people and people who are in both, you know, at the end of the day. So if you can influence the church in that way, you do influence the government in that way, almost by default, let alone if you are active and do other things. So I think that's one, as a African-American person, I think one of the greatest ways to be an ally is to get more people of the majority on board. Because once you have the majority, then you can do almost anything.
Unless there's a filibuster.
Right.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, I guess it's useful in trying to get people to agree to work on something. It's probably necessary to know what the goal is. So, you know, on reparations, it's too general of a concept for most people. Even people who would be favorable toward it don't know, well, what would it mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you can get people, I think you can often get groups and organizations and people to work for things that are pretty concrete. So, you know, your example of a laundromat, which at some level sounds trivial, of course, it wasn't trivial because it served both two purposes. One, the purpose, a practical need that people had, but also it's what Saul Alinsky, who was a great organizer, said, you know, start with things that are doable. Get small successes and build on small successes. Don't think you're going to just suddenly jump to the big success. Mm-hmm. And then you build a momentum of small successes. And so we have to, in some sense, know where those of getting together with people, we need to somehow figure out what are sensible small steps to get things started that people can agree on.
And that's why we can't do it without the leadership in the Black community. I mean, they would have to define. I don't think we can run out and do stuff.
Well, I'm new to this group here tonight. And I signed up because I know Gladys. I don't know if Gladys is going to be attending tonight, but I worked in this town for a long, long time. I worked in youth services for a long time. Ron, I believe you and I were in meetings together a long time ago. Perhaps Julian, I used to work at the mental health board. I was a youth services coordinator back in the late 80s and early 90s. And in those days, the youth services were excited about something called wraparound services. And it was involving multiple groups of people. And there were lots of speakers who said exactly what's being said tonight, is that the leadership has to come from the community where the issues are. The leadership can't come from the outside. There was a psychology professor named Bob Fellner who was brilliant. He talked a lot, but he too understood that he had, you had to wait for the leadership, local leadership, to step forward. And it's terribly frustrating. And so we were cutting edge back. And I remember I was running a workshop at the Levis Center. 300 people showed up across youth services. Judges, lawyers, teachers, counselors, foster parents, adoptive parents. I mean, we had everybody there. And it was cutting edge then, and it's cutting edge today. I mean, very little of what we were dealing with then is implemented today, even though it's the same information. And so I don't know what to say either. It's just good ideas don't stick because the new trend comes in every couple of years with a whole bunch of new money and just wipes out anything that we did. Anything that was done gets wiped away because there's a new trend in town. And there's no long-term history. There's no long-term memory that starts to take shape. So I don't know what you do with that, but
Good point.
and I agree with the small steps. I think it's a series of small steps. I've been involved in 2 programs dealing with the Holocaust. One of them started off as a national project. The other one started in Muhammad, Illinois, and became a national project. It was a small step that got the attention of the world. Somebody started collecting pop tabs. Strangest thing, it just came out of nowhere. The Jewish community was not involved. I knew all of the survivors in town. When that project started, the survivors were angry. It's like, pop tabs, what are they talking about? And people were insulted by the symbolism of this. And once they got a few million and it started to get attention, the survivor community said, well, they're doing something interesting there. And by the end of the project, they had 11.5 million pop tabs, and ABC News showed up with the whole news crew to put them on TV. And it was remarkable, and it wasn't planned. Nobody thought, it just kind of came about. So it's lightning. How do you create a program where lightning hits?
Right.
You don't know lightning's going to hit. So
Right.
I don't know what you do with it.
But your point is good, that doing what you can do and seeing if it happens is a good thing. Right.
Well, I think so. I mean, I don't regret a second of the time I was doing that work.
Right.
But the frustration part is that the ideas were very good ideas. They were state-of-the-art ideas. There were local people on board with all of it.
Right.
Now, there's a little bit of different thing here. When you're dealing with youth services, I learned the analyst at the mental health board, gosh, I'm forgetting his name right now. Anyway, he took me aside one day and he said, look, I got to explain this to you. I see all your enthusiasm. I see all of the, all of the energy you're putting into this. You have to understand something. Kids don't vote. The politicians will never give the money to the kids because they don't vote. End of story.
Yep.
You can hold it up and pretend that it's for kids, but it's never about the kids. It's about the money. And that was a hard lesson. I didn't believe him. And then, this many years later, I kind of accept the fact that that's the way it works. This is a different story, what you're talking about. So it's not about kids, but I don't know, I think it's relevant to understand the inertia that that the whole thing is about.
And your point that it can't be a fad, it's got to be.
Can't be a
pay
fad.
with is really true, right?
I think Julian said this, I got here a little bit late, so I don't know where the question was, but what is the goal? Who are we? Because we are a complicated, even whatever, 13 of us here. I'm sure there's plenty of contradictions within 13 of us. So.
Well, yeah, I think Julian made that point about it being broad. The vast majority of Americans over the years have always wanted healthcare reform. I mean, we're talking about all the way back to 1940s. You can trace it, and 2/3 of the country always was in favor of healthcare reform. So why did it take until 2010 for anything to pass? Well, all those 2/3 of people who wanted healthcare reform didn't have a clear idea about how to go about doing it, or disagreed about how to go about doing it. So while they had the majority of the people on the same page, the lack of that organization and that oneness of moving forward was basically defeated by the smaller group of people who just had a clear purpose. We don't want it. And so I think it is important to say, let's find something that we can really move forward with, and get as many people in coalitions and people on the same page as possible, so that whatever that is, it has a clear message and we can move forward. And I also do want to say that, this is a very unique, the fact that any church is talking about reparations is pretty, forward thinking. I mean, this is unprecedented, right? When do we know of churches truly having serious discussions and activities around reparations? And so if we can build on that starting point, and like I was mentioned earlier, getting more and more people in that mix, and maybe having some type of purpose from, the community of need and community of color, leading that purpose, what that purpose might be, but everyone could get on board for that, then we can actually make some hay, I believe, in that process.
Are you aware of other churches that are engaging this problem by talking about reparations? And
Maybe Renee knows.
Yeah, that I'm aware of. Renee, if you've heard anybody else doing this.
I mean, there are some organizations, that was part of what Vern was talking about and gave that article, and supposedly the Jesuits are doing something. Whether that's what that amounts to is, I think, a whole session in itself, of whether the Jesuits and those different organizations, how much is talk and how much is money. The words are important, as is the follow through. I would be interested, I think, that in hearing from Evanston, because they are so close to us, and finding a way for our faith community to have our city officials and county officials sit down with folks from Evanston who led that process, and say, how did that happen? And how did you take your history and turn that into a program? And even though it's not going to affect everyone, I have a nephew up there that I don't think their reparations are going to affect him, but it made a difference to him that they said they're doing it. It makes a difference that they're doing it.
Are there churches in Evanston who were engaged in this process?
Yes. Go ahead, Renee.
No, go ahead, Vern.
Oh, yes. When I was at Vineyard here, there was a young woman who had some consciousness, who is the education director in Evanston. I'm in contact with her, and I gave her name to Renee, and she was very heavily involved in what they did through that church, that Vineyard in Evanston, with this whole reparation thing. So she's very articulated. I think she would be I don't know, Renee, did you reach out to her yet, or?
I haven't. And I know that people at Replace Fellowship were involved. I think there are people of faith who were definitely involved in that effort. And so if there can be, a church and city official collaboration sort of thing, I think that makes a difference. But having independent churches sort of like ours doing this, I don't know that many of them, but I don't read as much as you guys do. So,
Renee, do you know of any African-American churches in the community that are discussing this? Or, Reverend Thomas's church, right?
Well, discussions among African-Americans about reparations always happen.
Yeah.
It's always been something where, we think we ought to get them, and so, I think that's why I go back to, I think where the momentum is to, and what's different now than before, was you utilize this platform that hasn't been there in the past to say, let's bring more people who normally wouldn't talk about this into the fold, and see if we can build that coalition of people, larger, than before. Because trust me, you're not going to get African-American churches saying, "Oh, we don't want those reparations." That's it. We're check. Get that accomplished. The difference that I think we need to look at is how do we build the coalition? How do we build, the Vineyards and the First Christians and the TCBCs and the Meadowbrooks and the Windsor Roads? How do we get all of them on this same page of, at the very least, talking about things like reparations, or at least gaining that extra layer of consciousness that maybe most of the people in those places have not considered before. That to me, that's where the power can lie.
So
What you were talking about, the Jesuits, the biggest, that I believe what you were thinking about earlier, someone was talking about it, the changes that were going on are at Georgetown, where Georgetown was the place where built on a lot of slave labor, and it's a Jesuit institution. And they have come forth with a whole program to make reparations for those families. So there's an obvious example of Jesuit organization supporting this. And I'm wondering about our local Catholic community as well as the Protestant community.
So Jeff, here is what I'm hearing as a difference, and then maybe you can tell me if I'm not hearing this correctly. I'm hearing you tell me that we white people need to talk to other white churches, and we need to take some leadership and talk to the white people. And I'm hearing Julian and Vern and these folks say, no, what we need to do is listen to the local people and listen to the Black community tell us what they need. And to me, those two sound like, I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive, but when I'm looking at what are we supposed to do next?
I would say
those diverge a little bit, Jeff. So talk to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it depends what your goals are. And for me, I believe that it's important to hear from the African community in terms of what needs to be met, and like the Lawndale example. But I think we need to utilize this opportunity to build the power of meeting those needs, because for the most part, we've always had a handful of people who were sympathetic and empathetic to issues of people of color and helped out in different ways and so on and so forth. And, that's always kind of been there. I think the opportunity lies in something that you don't need Black people for, and is to reach out to other white people and to see if we can change the whole context. Because for example, we have 100-some odd churches in Champaign-Urbana community. Could you imagine if the vast majority of these congregations across this city were on a similar page about the need to respond to, whether it be reparations or anything else in this vein? When you go to your city council, instead of having, maybe 15, 20 people pop in there, what if you had 150, 200 people pop in there? And so I think the opportunity is in that power of getting these numbers built up among the majority. Because in my opinion, that's why we've seen most of the change. We didn't see, hundreds of Confederate statues and stuff going down when Rodney King got beaten. We had riots there, but we did last year when we saw the greatest coalition of people, of a diverse group of people working together and being on the same page. And that was, symbolic, but I think that can transfer into policy, into laws, into other things that can make real change. So that's what my opinion is when it comes to what can be done and what in my opinion, what the opportunity is.
Okay, so now I have a next question. This is for Pastor Janet. You're still there, right? I can't see everybody. All right.
I'm here.
Here's the deal. At the Friday coalition prayer meeting that was across this community, which was super impressive, the churches that Jeff just mentioned, the Vineyard, those
right,
evangelical type churches,
right.
I didn't see those folks at the table, and so I'm wondering,
Mhm.
what is the organization of those folks that I feel like we're missing? It does feel like they don't show up at the Interfaith Alliance
Right.
meetings, and they're not in the Ministerial Alliance. So
Right.
where is that connection? What are we missing there?
I'd like to speak to that because
I think Vern is a better resource to speak to that historically, because you're right, there is a disconnect.
couple of things I want to say first about the differences you proposed, Renee, about Julian and I and Jeff. I think it's got to be parallel. I would say this, even if we began to organize among the white churches, which I think is absolutely, I agree with Jeff 100%. One of the things that's going to come up is, what does the Black church think? What does the Black community think? So that it has to be parallel. And the second thing, though, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but the chances of, because I mentioned Evanston Vineyard, everyone went, Vineyard's doing this. Well, I got to tell you something. This vineyard here, it's pretty unlikely. However, an amazing thing happened last summer that is, to me, because I worked in racial reconciliation at church for over 10 years, the young leadership in that church went to the Black Lives Matters rallies, and they let it be known at the church. Now that may say, whoa, they went to a rally, big deal. I guarantee you, it caused an explosion. There were people in the church that came to them and said, no, you do not do that, okay? And we know why, I don't have to go into that. So I happen to know those young pastors, and I don't know, and they have this tension point. I know them well enough to know, and Jeff knows what I'm talking about. I know them all in their own hearts. They're pretty open. They really see the injustice. They really want to be there. Same with the gay issue, that's separate. But because of their situation in an extremely Republican conservative community, they're terrified. Because if they go too far into it, they're liable to have their main people, including their money, being honest, walk right out the door. So they are really in attention. In Evanston, which has 50% or more, actually more than 50% Black participation in leadership, no problem, glad. But believe me, Urbana, Vineyard, and Evanston, Urbana, Illinois, and Evanston are way different places. So I'm not being discouraging of that. I think that the best way to do, if we go forward with this, trying to do the white coalition with churches, is to approach the churches we can, get them on board, get something going. And then, hat in hand, humbly, maybe as this thing gains some more national favor, whatever, hat in hand and say, hey, put our toe in the water, can we talk to you about this? I think they would. I think they'd talk. Whether they could break over that line to support, or maybe there's different levels that would have, but like I hate to quote Chairman Mao, but he said, revolution doesn't take place in a velvet box. Everything is incremental. So I'm endorsing both what Jeff said and what Julian and I said about moving forward, but don't kid ourselves. I mean, there's people around here that are going to go banana cakes. In fact, I'm sorry, one more quick thing. Today I read an article about what the Republicans are doing to attack Biden. There's 3 issues. Believe it or not raising taxes on the rich, which is absolutely mind-blowing, beyond belief. And I can't remember the second one. And the third one was a buzzword, police defunding. And the third one was reparations. And the Republicans are saying, hammer those home, because if you do it, they will never elect a Democrat because the white majority doesn't want that. I think they may be wrong down the line, but that's what they're saying. So we can't kid ourselves. We bring this stuff from reparations. It's going to have a bunch of people saying, yeah, a bunch of people throwing rocks at us. So, but it needs to be done. It absolutely needs to be done.
Yeah, I think there's some people in the Bible that had rocks thrown at them too. Some reasons.
No, you're gonna. I'm used to that.
Okay, I have so I know I'm having a lot of questions here, Jeff, but like, to those churches, say a Vineyard type church, if we had a specific project, a specific need, if that would get more traction than calling it reparations, is that good or is that problematic?
Those baby steps, right? And it depends, you have to cater to your audience. For some churches, you can introduce things with reparations right from the beginning, and they'll still have open ears. You can move forward. We know the other places you probably have to tweak your language in order to get into the door. And I think one of the things that Jesus was great at is knowing his audience, and I think that we can kind of navigate that based on who we're trying to reach and who we're trying to get to that next step. The tougher places, it may just simply be having a specific purpose and then seeing that they can join on board with that specific purpose and going from there. But for maybe some other churches that may be more open to have these conversations, have this institute, have this set of seminars for them. And so they can learn more, they can dig in deeper. And at some point, if you get that critical mass, which again is what has happened in the larger society over last summer, you get that critical mass, a lot of stuff can happen. So I think you start somewhere. And I do agree. I don't necessarily disagree that we need people of color to be in leadership to help guide what the needs are. So that's definitely a piece of it, but it is a both and kind of thing. Marcia, do you have a quick comment?
One of the things I was thinking, and you just sort of addressed it, Renee, it seems to me like how we bring those 2 points together, and maybe 3 points, what is reparations, is that, we need the leadership of the Black community to say, what can we do and what's most important? And if we could define that, say specifically, and then, instead of going out and generally and say, we need everybody to get on board to support reparations, let's say we need everybody to get on board to build a laundromat. And we need to raise $100,000 to build a laundromat. And we'll go and we build a coalition to do that. And maybe that would be the kind of, baby step that we need to take. And then in the process of doing that, there may be some education that goes along with that. But it seems to me like if we're going to go organize the white churches, it would be easier to do it selling them on a specific idea than to say you need to support reparations, because we don't really know what reparations means.
Good point.
And we haven't mentioned a lot of churches like Urbana Presbyterian or McKinley or UCC or St. Peter's. I mean, there's a lot between the most conservative and the most liberal.
Mm-hmm.
The new CU church, and also what's the one, Copper Creek. There's another church that probably
Right.
interested.
Right.
And I would add too, I think what's important, and I do believe that changing language is going to be key to get certain groups on board. I also want to make sure that it doesn't fall into this category of more like mercy or charity work.
Right.
I think the cool thing about you guys having reparation talks is that it's really hitting home this justice idea of justice that you may not capture if you water it down too much in certain situations. And but I totally agree that, certain places will just shut the doors right off the bat if you use that language. But I do think that is important to distinguish between, the usual giving to, African-American organizations to help African-American communities versus trying to do something, deeper, trying to do something that changes the whole atmosphere, the whole culture of this community when it comes to certain things. Because I don't want to see, one of my biggest fears when COVID started to die down and people started to play sports again, and we started getting to what Cornel West said, weapons of mass distraction. I was afraid, as much as I love sports, I was afraid for them to come back because I felt we're going to lose this momentum, we're going to lose this focus, we're going to lose this desire to see change happen. And I think it has kind of calmed down a bit since these activities started resurfacing. People started to get busy again. They're gonna start going to soccer practices, And so again, that's why I think that the timing wise, we really have to try to really strike this while it's hot, if you will, and try to get something different happening there.
So
I'd like
now,
to say that in terms of the specifics, Jeffrey, of what you just mentioned, to be related to justice, it requires evidence. And evidence is difficult for something there's no living representation. but there are stories, there's relatives, and there's people. I'm going to post a link here to an organization. I was part of this group. They started off, called themselves the Survivors of the Shoah Foundation. And it started up as a nonprofit through the University of Southern California to interview as many Holocaust survivors that were still alive as that were alive. And this started in the mid to late 90s. And so most people were in their 60s on up. And so there aren't very many people alive anymore. But the idea was to get people on videographers and real interviews where you heard people's actual stories. A lot of work went into making sure that this could be uncontested 100 years into the future, because they were well aware that digitization can create anything. And so they spent a significant amount of money making sure that the tapes and the digitizing process was unquestionable. So there was a lot of rules involved in, once the camera went on, it didn't go off. So there were no breaks in it. So in order to verify this thing. So here's my point of this. Once they were done, they did 65,000 interviews around the world. And then I think they went to Cambodia. And this website I'm just sending you is the number of projects they've done around the world now since this. And so I'm just looking at the page, Cambodian genocide. They went to Rwanda, they went to Armenia, they went to Guatemala, they went to Nanjing, they went to northern Syria. And they're continuing these kinds of oral history projects. And so it seems to me that family stories passed down have actual evidentiary, information. So it's hard to do this, just talking, because it turns into judgments, just a whole lot of judgments. But with real evidence where you hold up people, or you get lawyers to go through the books and go through somebody started talking about the red lines. What records still exist? Can you tie the records that still exist back to actual businesses that still exist? This is what happened after the Holocaust. The lawyers went to work. There was I don't know who they were, but man, there were a lot of them. And they went after companies in Germany and across Europe, and they got all the evidence, and they had to argue their cases in courts. And the courts had to literally say, okay, there's enough evidence here that we will agree that there needs to be some reparations. It wasn't about do the right thing. It was about, here's what you did. If you still exist today as a company, then here's what you owe. That's how it got done. And it wasn't about, it wasn't about judging. And I think that's where the trouble starts, because people feel like they're all being judged. And so they're not going to want to get on board. But with evidence, that's a different story. People understand evidence.
That's a really good point. That's what I think that both Georgetown and the Virginia school I talked about, they found out what really happened.
What really happened.
Yeah, what really happened. And they were able to relate to specific people and situations that were real, that were undeniable. And I think that may well be happening across this country. I mean, we're not the only people in this country sitting around talking about this. And I think it's probably going to be a confluence of a lot of different people in different places doing stuff and finding each other. I think there's an element of that, but all we can do is what we can do locally.
And it got down to, there's a painting hanging in somebody's living room, and we have evidence as to where that painting came from. And so it got down to that kind of detail.
Valerie, you had a comment, question?
Yeah, I guess I have a number of things that are going through my head. I think, for one thing, I think when what Robert Silverman is talking about is something is a case in which the people who stole are making reparations. I think the problem, of course, is that most white people today don't understand the privileges they have, and they don't feel that they have any guilt, and so they don't have a responsibility to repair. I just, I feel that, and for example, I mean, I hope my husband doesn't mind my using him as an example, but I mean, he's a typical typical person in his 70s, a white man, who had no idea, no understanding, and just saw all the improvements and sees, because he really has changed his mind. He saw Black people as sort of making demands, and it's always white people helping out Black people. What's going on here? But he has, in the last 10, 15 years, I've lost track, spent a lot of time in Chicago in places like Englewood and and also volunteering at the Jesse Brown VA hospital. And it has given him a completely different perspective. And I feel that preserving stories, sharing stories is really important in that way, because I think that people just simply do not know. I also, Jeff brought up the fact that for ever so long, the majority of people have wanted some kind of universal healthcare system. But I feel as if these days, especially, the evil that is in blatant lies, blatant, I mean, it's not just misperceptions. I think it's, some people have genuine misperceptions, but really blatant lies that are spread by those who oppose, all sorts of justice. The fact that somebody said that, the fact that we have the top Republican in the Senate saying his only job is to stop whatever Biden wants to get done. I mean, regardless. And I won't mention names, but somebody that a lot of us know who's a very sincere Christian, and I'm a Facebook friend with her, and she shared on Facebook that that Biden, wanted to defund the police and that our country would be totally ruined if he was elected, even though Biden had very explicitly said that's not what he wanted to do. So I feel like we are facing a substantial body of lies out there, malicious lies, as well as innocent misunderstandings.
Sure.
And so I do think that I like the idea of sharing people's stories. I think I don't know that a website would really do it, though. I think it's really important that we break down some of the barriers in our community in terms of working together on things, that people could really just come to know people and understand what they are going through.
Mhm.
Because I mean, I look at my own husband, and he was just absolutely genuinely shocked to find out about the sorts of things that Black people experience all the time.
Mhm.
People that he really respects a lot. And so, yeah, I feel that people are teachable, but there are obstacles, and we can't underestimate that. I have to be honest, as somebody who has, when I heard reparations, I thought, what, do I have to give away my house or something? And, um, and I think that having, some concrete steps is a really good idea. I don't remember the name of the pastor, Renee, who led the third conversation, but when people were asking for something specific, he specifically suggested the health center, the Champaign County Christian Healthcare Center, as a concrete project to support. So I guess I realize that we just have to do a lot of things on multiple levels. We need to reach out to other churches, and yes, we need to be in partnership with Black people and really listen to what they think that, the needs of their community are. But I think, somehow it would be great if we could get, you know, white people who just don't even know Black people, just to meet them, just to hear their stories and to come to understand, as well as, you know, having us work on concrete things. It's a lot to try to do at once, and maybe that sounds ridiculous. There will, as Jesus said, there will always be the poor in the world, right? So there's never an end to it. When when Robert Silverman and Vern Fine talk about things they did ages ago and the problems are ongoing, it's true. Nonetheless, we are in this world, I think, to share God's love to the best of our ability. And so I hope that we can apply some of the suggestions that have been made. Thanks.
And I'm surprised how fast times go by. Let's get a couple more comments, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up, unfortunately.
I was just going to, since we're talking a little bit about strategies and tactics, although I think there's a lot of conversation that has to precede strategies and tactics decisions. But I'm just curious, Jeff, the most recent appeal that the health center had for support, it was based this time, unlike previous things, on a very specific need.
Mm-hmm.
Real concrete. We need money to have this place, because if we don't have this place, we're not going to exist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious of what the reception has been compared to previous. Did being very specific help?
You talking with the mental health board in particular, or with our general fundraising campaign for the new building?
Yeah, it has helped to be specific about that, or not?
Yeah. I mean, we've actually raised more money in the last few months than we have in a while, because we had this very specific need in place, right? You know, so people definitely respond better to when you had that specific thing that everyone can kind of grasp onto and take a hold of. So there's definitely no question about that.
Yeah.
So if we can find something in this context like that we can, you know, take the traveling circus around and just get everybody to join the circus and get on board, I think that'll be fantastic.
The only other thing I feel like I just need to say before we end this meeting is that I don't think we should adopt the notion that we must say reparations any more than that we must say defund the police. I think what we must say is make steps that are necessary for moving us towards social justice for African-American people who, in a country that has a history of white privilege, whatever those steps are, I don't really care what we call it. And I don't think we should say defund the police. I think we should say things like redirect their activities to be more constructive, you know, because these things are heard differently by different people. And there are certain words that simply just create unnecessary contention. So if you can change the words without losing the actual goals that you're after, I think that's the trick.
I agree.
Last two comments, I got Mark and Janet and Marcia.
Right, just quickly to pick up a couple of the themes and underline them. Relationships, we've talked about the importance of that across the community. We do tend to work in, you know, we always talk about this at various community groups with silos. We are a very siloed, even though very active set of communities here. I found in pulling together that multi-faith service last Friday that so many of us really do, as faith leaders, have not met each other. And so this is one of our big, big challenges, is to have that sense of just knowing each other, having enough trust to say, yes, we do all care, believe that deeply, but how can we come together? So there are, I think, to me, this was very hopeful. that we are in a time of wanting to bring hope and healing. And the gun violence crisis in a way that none of us would wish opens up for an exploration of all the root causes that are helping to fuel this desperation, all the rest. So I'm not going to give any lecture on that, but I would like to pick up again on what Renee was saying, that if we can work, I think even build on some of that momentum, to keep trying to build bridges, develop that sense that we share common cause, that will take us far to bring hope and healing. And that the opportunity to tell stories, as I mentioned, there is a project underway. I think there's more interest in that. And I think if that's something that this group would want to encourage, I'd be happy to see what we could do by putting you in touch with some of those folks, because I'm part of a committee with the Community Coalition that's collecting strategies around race relations. So anyway, I think there's lots to do. And thank you, Jeff, for leading us through the conversation tonight. Very well done.
Pleasure. Thank you. Last comment there. You on mute there.
I take the point about not using a buzzword that, I'm still muted.
No, we hear
No,
you.
you're
Okay, not using a word that's gonna turn people off. But on the other hand, I think the word reparations has an element of apology in it that is important. We don't want it to just be charity, and I'm not sure justice encompasses it entirely. And the other reminder I would say is that the United Way, I think, is a good-hearted and very wields a lot of power in this community, and networking with them might be a good thing.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'll hand over to Renee to close us out.
All right, thanks, everyone. Yeah, I'm not sure what our next steps are, but I think we are on board for something next. I'm not sure what we'll do, if we'll do more this summer or we'll kind of start things up at the fall, but I will be, and feel free to send me, as Vern does, feel free to send me information, ideas, articles, as we I can be a gathering place for those, and we can kind of figure out what our next steps are. I really appreciate the expertise that each of you brings to these conversations. Many of you have been working for years on this, and it's evident, and it's a long road. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I think in this group, it would be appropriate if someone wanted to close us with prayer. If anyone.
I have an anecdote.
An anecdote? Okay.
An anecdote. I've been part of a Torah study group for 40 years in Champaign-Urbana. It's extraordinary because it doesn't have a leader. I've been to Torah study groups all over the place, and this one is extraordinary because even the rabbi does not lead the show. And even when a new rabbi comes to town, we have to teach him, you don't run this group. This is a group that anybody can say whatever they need to say. And one of the things that always gets said when new people come in is that the stories are bad stories. There's some really ugly stories. And we still read it this many hundred centuries and millennia after this. We read them because they're bad stories. This is part of humans. This is what we do. And people relate to that statement because I work in the counseling field. I still work in the counseling field, and people are so incredibly strong, it's unbelievable. People go through suffering all the time. I deal with people with health concerns, with poverty concerns, with everything. Trauma, the kind of trauma, we all know about the trauma, but there's so much trauma out there. And so reminding people who are religious, people who say, I never want to go to religion anymore, I've had my fill of it. everybody relates to the Psalms. I love referring people to the Psalms, especially the one where the hyena eats somebody's face. Everybody laughs at that because most of them don't remember it or they've never read it. And I think that there's something in there about the fact that these are not new stories.
Right.
I've been doing this 40 years. That's less than a blink. I mean, it's like zero. So anyway, that's my anecdote.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Us.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
All right.
Thanks,
Night.
Jeff.
Bye.